Okay, so it is 7 o'clock. I move that we open the meeting of the Conservation Commission of Marshfield for Tuesday, September 23rd, 2021. May I have a second?
Second.
Okay, Joe Ring.
Roll call vote. Arthur, Commissioner Lage,
Here?
Okay, that's an aye or an A?
Yes. Aye.
Thank you, sir.
Vice Chair O'Donnell,
Bert O'Donnell, yes.
Commissioner Karen,
Susan Karen, yes.
Commissioner Ring,
Joe Ring, yes.
Commissioner Hannafin, yes.
Okay, and I note that Commissioner Carberry is out with other duties.
Okay. Tonight's meeting is different than our normally scheduled public hearings. We are here to get a presentation from Rebecca Haney, who is the Certified Floodplain Manager and Coastal Geologist for Coastal Zone Management. With her will be Andrew Poyant, the Mass DEP Wetlands Environmental Analyst and Circuit Rider for the Waterways Program, and Jason Butner, who is the South Shore Regional Coordinator for Coastal Zone Management. So we will have the presentation. At the end, there will be an opportunity for questions and discussions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for being here, Rebecca.
Absolutely. So part of my role at CZM is to provide technical assistance to conservation commissions, and CZM works jointly with DEP to do that. So Andrew Poyant is the circuit rider for DEP, so this is a joint presentation that was put together. We also checked in with other DEP staff to make sure that our message is consistent, because we want to make sure that what we're telling you is consistent with policy. So this has certainly been vetted. And the focus of the presentation will be on delineation, function assessment, and protection of coastal dunes and barrier beaches. This is trying to focus on some of the Commission's questions, and so it's a kind of a narrow presentation. Even though CZM has a lot of different roles in providing technical assistance to the town and works with other local officials on various projects, this is kind of a focused presentation based on those specific questions.
Rebecca might chime in just real quickly. I've seen Rebecca speak on many topics. She brings tremendous factual data at MAC courses, which we all in conservation revere the various courses. You're one of the ones who presents higher order, and thank you. And Andrew, you too. Jason, for your service, also thank you. Just letting everybody know we have some very solid individuals at the state level here.
Thank you. So Jason and Andrew, you can hear me okay? Great. Just making sure. My voice doesn't always carry, so. There are a lot of challenges with managing coastal areas, trying to balance some of the human uses with protection of the natural resources, and trying to do that is something that we try to provide guidance on. Storm damage is something that you are not, is not a new thing for Marshfield. You've got a regular issue with some of the nor'easters, the overtopping of the seawalls, and a lot of that storm damage protection can't even think of the right word. It does make a difference how we develop in the floodplain and how things are built as to what kind of storm damage we have. So the storm damage prevention and flood control functions under the Wetlands Act are important to consider, and I'm going to talk about some of the specifics of things that make a difference. If we can go to the next slide. So the first thing I'll talk about is there's a little bit of overlap between the State Building Code and the Wetlands Protection Act for coastal dunes. They both have a requirement to put buildings on open pilings. And so some of that can get confusing, and so I want to try to clarify the purpose of each of those and how they interplay. And then I'll talk about coastal dune and barrier beach protection under the Wetlands Protection Act. We've developed a guidance document to help with these issues, and I'm going to go over some of the how to use that. It is a 300-page document, but it's not something you need to read cover to cover to have it be a resource for you. So I'm going to try to go over that and make it a little more user-friendly for you to use as a reference on a regular basis. So we'll talk about some specific guidance of delineation of how to delineate coastal dunes, particularly in some of these challenging areas. When you have alteration, that makes it more challenging, but that doesn't mean there isn't a way to approach it. So we'll also talk about the function of developed dunes and barrier beaches, examples of coastal dune function, some of the lessons learned from storm events, not only here in the state, but also from other major disasters, and talk about some specific activities that can adversely affect those functions. So that's kind of an overview of the presentation. Next. So in the 7th edition of the State Building Code, there were requirements for the foundation type in coastal dunes to be open pilings that were added to the State Building Code. And that was added for a couple different reasons. Number one was for some consistency with the Wetlands Protection Act. But number two was, more importantly, for public safety and to incorporate some of the, there's some very specific guidance to reduce property damage and take into account that you get erosion in coastal dunes, and this is something that FEMA's documented in many events and had the requirement in the actual code, but it was written in a way that wasn't very clear. So we made it very clear. Open pilings in coastal dunes, much easier to decipher. So then that's assisting the natural capacity of of dunes to provide the storm damage protection and flood control. Next slide. So under the National Flood Insurance Program, there are some minimum requirements that communities need to implement. Some of those are implemented through zoning, building code, but the protection of having no adverse impact on primary dunes is actually implemented a lot through the Wetlands Protection Act, because we do have a no adverse impact standard in the Wetlands Act. But it's also important to have some consistency between that and the building code. There's some specific requirements. ASCE is the American Association of Civil Engineers, and they have established the flood standards document. It's ASCE 2414 that is referred to in the building code for flood standards. And it specifically talks about foundations constructed on erodible soils shall be on open pilings. And erodible soils translates to coastal dunes and beaches. So if you have something that's more cohesive, like a glacial sediment or peat, that's not erodible soils. So coastal dunes, whether it's sand, gravel, or cobble, those sediments are very erodible in storms. And so that standard was established because of some of the damage that they were seeing in post-storm. And so that requirement was just not very clear and specific, and it was made more specific by saying it needs to be on open pilings. FEMA Coastal Construction Manual also highlights the importance of protecting those storm damage prevention, flood control functions, and having foundations in dunes on open pilings. Next slide. So this is an example of some houses that were located in a dune that was mapped outside the floodplain. And unfortunately, the FEMA floodplain maps don't always consider the effect of multiple storms. Some of our maps can be outdated. And so some of these houses were not constructed on open pilings, and they were in jeopardy as a result of the erosion that occurred in a number of storms back to back. So that's one of the reasons that they have that requirement, is to consider the effect of multiple storms and that erosion is going to constantly be shifting in these areas. Next slide. So FEMA has developed a fact sheet that highlights the issues associated with erosion and scour and storms, and that you often see this dramatic change in elevation that isn't always taken into account as part of the design. Next slide. So the Mass State Building Code in order to implement that standard, the Board of Building Regulations and Standards asked Coastal Zone Management and the Department of Environmental Protection to put together some maps to help building officials figure out where coastal dunes might be, and then in order to actually establish where the dune is, then it's up to the Conservation Commission and DEP to make that decision. So these maps that they put together, the building map of coastal wetland resource areas for building officials, those are based on the DEP GIS wetlands layers that are primarily based on aerial photo interpretation. Those are not intended for site-specific delineation. They give you a general idea of where the resource might be, but they are very, very general. You can't tell, is a dune in or out based on looking at those, or are you on or off a barrier beach? You need to do the site-specific delineation, but they give you a general idea of what the resource might be, and that lets the building official know they need to talk to the commission about that specific project that's coming before them. So they reach out to you, and there's something in the code that specifies that they're looking to you for a resource delineation, for you to make the decision, or for DEP if it gets appealed to them, to make that delineation. And so they're relying on you for that, and then once they know whether it's a coastal dune or not, then they apply the building code. The building code is primarily for structural integrity of the building, and the Wetlands Act is looking primarily at landform function. So you are doing two different things, but they both have the same end result, which is the open pilings. Okay? It's not, okay, next slide. So the difference between an open piling foundation and a pier foundation is that the pilings go straight down and are just the column, and it is embedded much deeper in the ground. And so that's what they referred to in that technical document about wanting deep foundations. Whereas a pier foundation, the column goes down to a footing, and that footing is usually considered part of the integrity of the dwelling. Those, sometimes it's just a footing around the individual piling or column, and sometimes those are connected by a grade beam. But you do get more scour than those take into account, and you get scour around the individual column or post. You have increased scour if you have a footing or a grade beam. And so those actually interfere with the function of the dune, as well as causing the additional scour, which can jeopardize the building. So it's important when somebody's proposing a building to ask specifically about whether it is pilings or piers or columns, and to make sure it's specific in your order, that it be open pilings with no grade beams or footings. The building code says the same thing, open pilings, no grade beams or footings, so just to be very clear.
What kind of beam? One more time?
Grade beam.
Grade. Okay, thank you.
Yep, absolutely. All right. So before I go on to the coastal manual, are there any questions on the building code piece I just covered? Okay. All right. So
Rebecca, this is Andrew Stewart, I'm the building commissioner.
yes.
I just wanted to mention, you had mentioned ASCE 24 and the coastal construction manual. So I have both of those in the building department. I also have all the FEMA technical bulletins and everything else that kind of we need for guidance. So if anybody needs any reference or wants to take a look at them, I've got access to all of them.
Andrew, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand those two different, and particularly for the public to understand that you are protecting two different things. Some people do come in and say, well, I'm meeting FEMA standards, I'm all set. It's not just about meeting FEMA standards. The building code is separate from FEMA standards, and the Wetlands Protection Act is protecting landform function. Those are two different things. Even though the standard is pilings, in both, it's for two different reasons. And so it's not, you have to comply with one or the other. You have to meet both. So that's important. Okay.
Duly noted.
All right, so the coastal manual, I shortened the title a little bit because as you can see, it is a little long. We wanted to make sure it was clear what it was, but it does get a little lengthy to explain. So it's focused on the storm damage prevention and flood control functions under the Act. There are a lot of different interests under the Act, and if we tried to cover all of those, I think it would be would have taken a lot longer and be a much thicker document. But this is, trying to provide a lot more guidance for commissions because there's more than what's in the regulations themselves. There's things that we say on a regular basis that weren't written down and available to all commissions, and we want to provide that guidance and make it more accessible. So it was developed by CZM and DEP as a joint effort. It was issued in 2017. And the state went through a whole update of our website, so we had to update all the URLs in 2020. But there's, it is a document that we will continue to update as needed over time. Go to the next slide. So in Chapter 1, it focuses on the resource areas and their delineation. So when you're dealing with a specific question about how do I delineate a resource, or is it this does it meet these criteria? There's specific guidance in there that talks about how to evaluate it, what kinds of information you should ask for or expect applicants to provide you with. And those are really important, to have. As an example, coastal banks, there's specific cross-sections and slopes and information that they should be providing you to back up their delineation rather than just here's where it is on a plan. So there's very specific suggestions in there for that. And we also talk about how to delineate resource areas in the field, what are some of the things to look for, and there are checklists included as well for that. So Chapter 2 focuses on the function analysis. And sometimes we see people jump straight to, well, it doesn't function, so it's not this resource area. You need to delineate the resource area based on the definition first, and then look at the function and what it provides under the Act. So there's specific information about how to determine if it provides the storm damage prevention and flood control functions, and talks about what the significance are, and some things are presumed significant, and that's important to know right up front. Excuse me.
You're good.
Okay, next slide. The Chapter 3 talks about the performance standards, provides the detailed requirements for each performance standards, lists typical project activities. That's a great reference to go to when you're trying to think of, would this type of project interfere with the functions or the standards for this resource? There's some great information there that you can look at and use as a good go-to. I get a lot of questions from commissioners that call and ask, or agents, and that's one of the first places to go to as a starting point. Chapter 4 has some specific selected case studies they're meant to be, they're based on real cases, but we've made sure that we did not use any names, places, or people in there, but it does give you some idea of how to walk through a project based on the kinds of things that we're recommending that you do. Next slide. And then the appendices, we have a glossary. Obviously, there's a lot of terminology, and we try to make sure that the document is as understandable as possible. We don't want to be using technical terminology that is not easily understood. There's a lot of useful data sources listed, some technical specifications for delineating primary frontal dunes. That's not something that had been provided in the past, and we tried to make sure that that was some guidance for commissions. The policy for delineating coastal banks is in there with some examples of how to measure slope and how to walk through that analysis. And then using an engineer scale and some references are also included. So it's a good resource for you, and hopefully it's something that you can start using as a reference. Next slide. So the delineation of coastal dunes can be relatively straightforward in areas like Wrexham, where you have natural dunes that are a nice hill mound or ridge of sand, you have vegetation, it's relatively straightforward. And we wish all projects were simple and straightforward like that, but that's not the nature of what you see all the time. So if we can go to the next slide. There's a lot of places or factors about sites that make them more challenging to interpret when you look strictly at the regulation or the definition. So hill mound or ridge is something that, people are thinking, okay, it has to look like a hill mound or ridge. Well, what about a flat dune? Or is it a dune? And if you stand on top of a resource like this where it looks all flat, that begs the question, is it a hill mound or ridge? Even though you have the pond on the back side and the ocean on the front side, and it clearly looks like sand and vegetated, that question has come up quite a bit is, well, what about if it's flat? If you go to the next slide, and you actually look at a profile that's shore perpendicular through that dune, going from ocean on the left to the pond on the right, relative to the beach, it is still a hill mound or ridge. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to look at the resource in context relative to the beach. And that's important in a lot of these, that's something that we tend to say quite a bit, is looking at things in context. Next slide. Secondary dunes can also appear very flat. But again, if you looked at the whole profile of the area relative to the beach, this is still going to be within that hill mound or ridge. Next slide. So, gets a little more complicated when you have human alterations that have flattened a site and put riprap along the shore. Then it doesn't even resemble something that someone would call a dune. And the question is, how do you delineate it? And the way we differentiate coastal dunes from coastal banks has a lot to do with what the subsurface sediments are. What are the underlying sediments? If it's wind or wave deposited sediments or artificial fill performing the functions of storm damage prevention and flood control, then it's a coastal dune, even if it's been flattened and armored. The function may have changed. So, but looking at the delineation, it's the subsurface sediments that you need to look at. If we go to the next slide. So if you look at the subsurface sediments, sometimes it's a little more obvious than others. In this particular situation, there's actually some soil profile development, and that's just because the dune hasn't moved in a long time. So just because you have some coloration and some soil profile development doesn't mean it's not a dune. But what you need to look at, you can use the Berry Beach inventory maps and the DEP GIS layers I mentioned as a place to start. But you definitely have to do that site-specific analysis to look at those characteristics. So it's the difference between the wind and wave deposited sediments, artificial fill, and glacial. And you look at the thicknesses across the site. It's not as simple as just one point. You usually have to look at multiple points to do that delineation. Next slide. So there can be cases where there are tapering dunes in terms of the thickness. Some people ask about veneers of dunes, whether if you just have a thin veneer of sand, is it still a dune? So to be considered a coastal dune under the regulations, the landform needs to meet the definition. Located landward of a coastal beach, consisting sediments deposited by wind, wave action, or storm overwash, and exhibiting the hill mound or ridge topography. The hill mound or ridge topography we've talked about can be modified, but it's usually an elevated landform relative to the beach. And artificial fill is going to provide a little bit more complication that I'll talk about. If we go on the next slide. So in the manual, we have some cross sections that give you some examples of how to think about this. And this is a shore perpendicular cross section. The tan area is the coastal dune sediments that are the wind or wave deposited material based on the subsurface investigations. That's the thickness and the extent. And then the darker brown on the left is glacial material. And so even though the superficial expression of the landform looks like you have a second ridge there, when you look at the subsurface, it really is this primary ridge, and then it's tapering landward. And we use the red arrows to show where you might reasonably call the landward extent of that dune. Because you're looking at what sediments are still reasonably part of that landform or going to function as part of that landform. As it tapers landward, some people ask for a specific number of inches. You know, what's the minimum inches it has to be? And it's not as simple as that, because dunes can be very different sizes. And so if you have a dune that's much smaller, then 6 inches is more important. But if you have a dune that's 30 feet, it might not be as important. It's a matter of making a judgment call based on looking at the relative, the whole landform. So in this example, we have the dune sediments again, but as they go landward, you then have a uniform thickness overlying the glacial sediment, and that's not unusual when you have windblown sand. And what the guidance says is that where you have this uniform thickness overlying the glacial to the left there, that's not part of the Hillmounder Ridge form. It's a veneer. And so between the red arrows again is where we would suggest calling the landward extent of the dune. And then the third example shows you just the dune tapering over a lower glacial deposit. It's the same kind of analysis. Now this gets a little more challenging when you have altered sites, but this is trying to give you an approach as to how to look at the sites relative to the other resource areas or the other types of sediment. So the methodology is to define the thickness and the characteristics of the subsurface sediment and layers, the method of deposition, and then make sure you have multiple transects across the site. It depends on what kind of, whether it's sand, gravel, cobble, as to what you need to use. Sometimes an auger is sufficient, but if you, in Marshfield where you have more cobble and gravel, that might require a little more digging than just the auger. So the depth of analysis will depend on the height of the dune and the type of materials you find. If you go down a few feet and, you clearly have all dune, in a lot of cases that's sufficient, but it depends on the site. Next slide. So dune sediments are typically, the grains themselves are typically more well-rounded than glacial sediments and tend to be more well-sorted in obvious layers. And it's helpful because there is so much difference between sites to look at. Obviously, this dune is going to look very different than some of the dunes in Marshfield where you have more mixed sediment. And so looking at what you have on the beach as an example of what kind of sediments you should expect in the dune is a good way to look at it, to think about it, because it's the beach sediments that were the origin of the dune to start with. Next slide. So when you have dune sediments overlying something else, in this case, the lower material here that you see is the darker brown is actually glacial material. And so we have coastal dune overlying bank. And there's two different ways to look at what's the resource area here, and two different ways that we explain it in the manual. One is if you have a proposed project that wants to put some kind of shore protection structure on the face, then the way that you determine whether it's dune or bank is to look at the thickness of the dune versus the thickness of the glacial material down to mean high water. And if the dune is 50% or more, then it's coastal dune. If the glacial's 50% or more, it's bank. Mm-hmm. That's just for the purposes of armoring the face of the resource area. If you're proposing something on top, such as a house or whatever other development, it is a different scenario because you're looking at what is the sediments on the top, how are they functioning? And so in this case, you've got a couple feet of dune sediments there that would function. They would move, shift, migrate, perform storm damage prevention and flood control on the surface of the site like a dune, not like a bank. And so in this case, that should have open pilings for a house that's put there. So there's a different methodology depending on which one you're looking at. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And then you have situations where you need to figure out where the end of a Berry Beach or dune is on the margins. And this is a situation at Ipswich where they needed to put something right on the edge. There's a Berry Beach in between these two glacial bluffs, and they needed to figure out exactly where that boundary was for a project. And so we'll go to the next slide, which is a shore parallel transect of the Berry Beach in the middle and the glacial on both sides. And it's the same approach as what I was showing in the other transects. It's just shore parallel instead of shore perpendicular, looking at how it transitions to the edges. And so in some of these situations, it's simple dune sediments. In other times, it can be a little more complicated. If we go to the next slide. In this case, they had, a developed road there. Next slide. And in order to figure out what the sediments were, they actually used a core to punch through the road and look at those sediments. We go to the next slide. And what they found is at the top of the core, which would be the top of the ground surface, down the first 8 inches, 9 inches there, that was artificial fill, which was put in for the roadbed. And then below that was the dune sediments. And so artificial fill that is performing the functions of storm damage prevention and flood control, in other words, if it's in the floodplain and the floodwaters are going to overtop it, would still be considered coastal dune, even if it's paved. So it's important to think about the artificial fill relative to its position in the floodplain. There's the example that I give when you're thinking about when artificial fill would make the resource something else. There was a site where they put 30 feet of fill vertically on top of a Berry Beach to create a railroad passageway.
Yeah, right.
Yep. And that was way outside the floodplain in terms of the elevation. That resource could no longer function like a dune. It could just erode and provide sediment to the beach. It couldn't get overtopped, couldn't provide those same storm damage prevention, flood control functions. So in most cases, when you have artificial fill in a lot of your developed areas, there's still going to be dune. In most cases, it's not that level of fill. But that's one way to think about it. Okay. Next slide. So the USDA they have a Natural Resources Conservation Service has a soil survey that's available online where you can get some information about what the subsurface soils are. This is mapped at a pretty broad level, so it gives you a general idea. Again, it's not going to be good enough for site-specific exactly where the boundary is, but it does give you some information about the subsurface soils as a starting point. Next slide. So if we go back to that site that has all the alteration, and the question was, there was a house or a cottage on the site, and they wanted to take that down and put up a new building. What kind of foundation does it need to be on? So in the next slide, this is what the subsurface sediments look like. The ocean is at the top of the slide. You can see the revetment. And then they actually had lawn on this site. They put in some fill to create a lawn. So the first layer there is actually the fill, but below that is the mixed sand, gravel, and cobble, just like what's on the beach. And so the origin of this site was dune sediments, winter wave deposited. The artificial fill was in the floodplain, and so it was still performing the functions of storm damage prevention, flood control, even though it's been flattened and put a lawn on it. That would still perform those functions. It would still be considered to provide those under the Act.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
And then if you get to a site, this is Bay Ave in Marshfield, where you have even more alteration. If we go to the next slide, looks at an aerial photo. In context, the barrier beaches are by definition a relatively narrow landform deposited by wind or wave action with a wetland or water body behind it. by definition, that's a barrier beach, even though there's been all this alteration. And, you can see how much on that one's example, that's still considered barrier beach. So in a barrier beach, you either have coastal dune, beach, or wetland. Those are the 3 resource areas. So even with all that alteration, the underlying resource where those houses are is going to be coastal dune. Next slide. So just reiterating, if the soils are wind or wave deposited or the artificial fill in a flood zone, it's a coastal dune. Pavement, concrete, houses with solid foundations doesn't change the fact that it's still a coastal dune. If it's behind a seawall, revetment, bulkhead, any other coastal engineering structure, it's still a coastal dune. With those caveats of what the sediments are. And under a paved roadway, the same thing. Okay? Next slide. So the Wetlands Act does define primary dunes and all dunes on barrier beaches to be per se significant, which is a presumption that can't be overcome. So they are to storm damage prevention, flood control. So it's really important to consider, that that's a presumed function when you're on a barrier beach or in a primary frontal dune. Primary frontal dune is the first dune along the beach in most scenarios. If you're on a barrier beach, then they meet that definition of the ocean on one side, the wetland or water body on the other side. So they are significant because their volume determines how much storm damage protection they can provide to landward areas. And so and their ability to dissipate the waves and for the sediment to move is critical. If they are completely armored in a way that they can't do that, then you're not going to have much storm damage protection and flood control. So what happens on particularly the seaward lot affects the landward lot or affects the town infrastructure. So the functions include dissipating the waves, slowing down the overwash, and acting in some cases as a reservoir of sand for the beach. It depends on the site and whether it's armored with a seawall or not. So altered or developed dunes may not have that sediment exchange with the beach, but they still have that storm damage prevention flood control function. And you need to think about what they would do or how they would look in a major to moderate to major coastal storm. It's not, when we go out and look at site visits for projects, it's not how we see it that day. It's what it would look like in a storm. It's a little challenging to imagine sometimes, but that's what you're considering. Next slide. So a quick review of FEMA flood zones, because we use these to look at what the different flood characteristics would be. A velocity zone is areas where you have 3 feet of wave height or greater, or wave run up of 3 feet or greater. The AE zone is divided into the moderate wave action area and the minimal wave action area. And this is probably new terminology to you, but when you see the land subject to coastal storm flowage performance standards coming out this fall from DEP, you have a crash course in some new terminology. You've got the advanced look at it, but FEMA has this distinction on their maps already between the MOA and the MIWA. And those two areas are, there's a line that goes between them to delineate them called the LIMWA, or the limit of moderate wave action. And that gives you an idea because the MOA is the portion of the A zone when a 1.5 to 3 foot breaking wave. That is considered significant because FEMA has found that you get significant damage to structures built to A zone standards, traditional A zone standards, if you have that kind of wave energy. And so that's important to consider the kind of energy that you have in the zone. And then the minimal wave action area, you still have some waves and some overwash, some moving water, particularly in coastal areas. Once you get further inland, then you may have just still water. But the A zone isn't just still water, is the bottom line. And then the overwash areas can have flows with depths of 1 to 3 feet. Overwash areas would typically be delineated where you have seawalls, and then you see the overwash FEMA seems to have simplified that a little bit on their more recent maps. And so even though you have overwash areas, they're not all delineated in a very detailed way on your flood maps. Next slide. So in cross-section, this shows you the velocity zone, and then the A zone split into the two different zones. The MOA is also referred to as the coastal A zone. It gets a little confusing to use coastal A zone, though, because it's not just all A zones along the coast. Okay. So on a flood map, what that looks like is that you've got the velocity zone on the right. The white lines are the boundaries between zones. The black line with the triangles is the limit of moderate wave action. And the triangles are pointing towards the higher wave energy area. And so if we start at the top of the screen, you have a velocity zone transitioning to a zone AE elevation 16. So that would be your coastal A zone or your MOA between the black line and the other white line. And landward of that would be the minimal wave action area. And that's in that situation, it's a relatively gently sloping area. Where you have more steeply sloping topography, the zones change much quicker. And so FEMA only maps zones where it's a certain thickness. So down at the bottom of the screen here, it's a much steeper sloping area. So it goes straight from a velocity zone to the minimal wave action area without even having a coastal A zone polygon. And so it's important to look, that black line is actually overlapping with the white line. But that's what you're seeing. So differentiating those can be a little tricky sometimes. But there is a way in the FEMA map viewer to actually turn the LIMWA on and off so that you can see that difference. Okay? So one thing I recommend is always checking your flood zone delineations on the Map Service Center portal. Even though we have a lot of other GIS resources, there's so many map changes going through, and most of the portals like the MassGIS and even CZM's viewer, our Morris viewer, do not get updated with new flood layers very often. It's usually every couple of years. The Map Service Center has all of the flood zone changes up to date, and there's a lot of people that are applying for flood zone changes on a regular basis, so it's always good to check that portal. And that does have the ability to turn off that layer for you so that you can check and see whether it's overlapping with the white line. So when you're looking at a specific site and trying to look at what the storm damage prevention, flood control issues might be, you want to look at which flood zone it is, how high the base flood elevation or the 1% chance flood elevation is above the ground elevation. So how much water is it predicting would be going across the site in a storm? And if it's an A zone, how close is it to the V or the coastal A zone? How close is it to the coast? Are you going to have moving water associated with that? So there's a big difference between Brant Rock and Bay Ave than someplace a mile inland. There's a big difference. So field observations regarding the extent of storms and the kind of processes that you see in storms are helpful to have for reference. Our office does coordinate a coastal storm damage assessment team, and all of their reports, observations, photos go into this online viewer, which is mycoast.org /MA. The Storm Reporter tool is what we use, and you can go in and search reports by date, by community, and look at what's been documented over time. And this is something that I encourage commissions to do, is to have somebody that lives locally that is willing to go out and do some of that documentation safely, of course, in storms. You don't want to be out there during the height of the storm trying to do that. You need to make sure it is safely. You do have several storm you've got a couple storm bugs in town that like to go out and document and post on Facebook. You know, you've got some folks that do that. Yeah,
I
so.
was gonna say, so what we do, every storm, after the storms in 2018, we were dealing with FEMA and MEMA. What they suggested we do, and we do this on a regular basis, if we're gonna get a bad storm in the winter, northeasters, summer hurricanes, we get the drones up.
Yep.
Before the storm comes in, we go up and down the coast, we take pictures of all the seawalls, the
Yep.
riprap, all of that, and then right after the storm, we go back out so that we can quantify what the actual damage was in that particular storm.
Absolutely, and, you know, for the commission to try to document some of what you're seeing in terms of the overwash and the erosion, that's helpful to you. You know, documenting the damage for FEMA for the seawalls is one piece, but looking at what's happening with overwash and where you're getting it, you're going to have different types of storms that cause different damages. In 2018, you'll remember that the water level was so significant in Boston that, you know, it set a new record. But that storm was significant just for the elevation of the water, not so much for the waves. And so it affected different areas. And then in March, we had storms, we had a nor'easter that hung out for at least 3 days. That had the wave component, and it did very different damage. So each storm is unique in terms of where it comes from and what the damages are, and trying to document some of that over time is really helpful for commissions in terms of the project management.
It seems like wave attenuation, it can move and shift, to Rebecca's point, and so there's others out there that may not be sophisticated, so that waves will target, but they are not consistently on one area. They'll shift with volume of water, energy in the water, etc. So there's many variables, so they don't always obey exactly the same patterns. And wave attenuation can switch
Yeah,
and shift.
it depends on the direction of the storm. It depends on the wave period. It depends on, you know, some of the seas built up, whether it hits at high tide, low tide. There's a lot of different variables.
And we had that with the 18 was the easiest to identify because you had so many tides over
Yes.
the period of time that did not go out.
Yes.
We have areas of our town where we got the river on one side and we got ocean influence on the other side. And, you know, when the tide doesn't fully go out, it backs all the resource into the marsh and into the river, and then which then comes back up the street on the other side.
It's like a hydrological dam, you know, to Mike's point, you know, it's just crazy. That was a real and unique one.
Yeah, it's, you know, we haven't had a lot of the bigger storms in a while, thank goodness. But those ones that we have had, you know, we see a lot more damage, and we need to try to learn from that and make sure that we're improving how we deal with these storms as we go. Okay, so next slide. So in developed dunes, what kind of foundation you have does make a big difference. And Cielo House has a solid foundation. Again, this is an area that was unfortunately mapped as outside the flood zone, and they put this in. The reflection off the foundation increases the erosion and makes them get undermined even quicker. If we go to the next slide, there's a lot of scour adjacent to the house that occurred shore perpendicular because of some of the scour and erosion reflected off that solid surface. So solid surfaces and dunes are just, they cause more erosion, and they aren't helping it to provide that storm damage protection you want. If it was a pile-supported foundation, then the dune would be able to function much better to dissipate that energy. You can go on the next slide. So I'm going to use an example from Hull where they actually came to us for technical assistance because they were having so many problems with storm damage on this very beach that Atlantic Ave was getting ripped up several times a winter, and this is an evacuation route, it's critical. And their question was, what do we do about it? How do we slow this down? They do have a seawall along the seaward side. There's a revetment, but there's still a lot of overtopping. I'm sure this sounds a little familiar when you still have structures and still have overtopping, but some of it had to do with the structure needed some modifications, but it also had to do with some of the way that the water was being channelized once it came over the wall. So if we go to the next slide, There were a lot of houses on solid foundations, a lot of pavement, a lot of concrete slabs, and some retaining walls that were channelizing the flow so that it was more water going through a smaller area at a higher velocity. And that causes more damage. And so when it gets channelized through an area, it can rip up pavement pretty easily, causes a lot of erosion and scour. It was washing a lot of sediment into Straits Pond, and the town was really struggling with the damages to the road. And so when we provided them with some assistance, we looked at some options for addressing the seawall, but they also needed to look at trying to retrofit a lot of the homes, get those up on pilings, because if the overwash can flow over a broader area, then it dissipates the energy much more effectively than if it's channelized or if it's speeding up across a solid surface. So if we go to the next slide, if we can try to play this video. This is a storm from Crescent Beach in Hull. The conservation administrator shot this video. This was a relatively small storm, and that's the overwash coming over the seawall. And you can see the power of the water. And that's not even a really big storm. I mean, we're talking about what happens in the moderate to major storms. He wouldn't be able to be there in a big storm because that's how significant it is. But, I mean, you know how heavy those larger, older TVs are. And the power of water is very significant. So you want to think about what that damage is going to do if we channelize it by some of the things that we do with coastal properties. Then it's going to cause more issues for more people. Next slide. So I mentioned that FEMA goes out, they have building science engineers that go out after major disasters and take a look at why, basically do forensic analysis of why buildings failed. Was it older building codes? Was it something that we can learn from in terms of things have changed? And, you know, there's been a whole series of things that have evolved over time in terms of how we improve the way we build on the coastal areas. And so this mitigation assessment team puts out these reports after each disaster. And I think the Hurricane Sandy one is one of the ones I think is more helpful to us in some ways because it's closer. Rather than, there are a lot of lessons learned from the Gulf Coast ones as well, but I think it's most relevant to think about a storm that was closer in geography. So some of the recommendations typically apply to how we build buildings, but some of it applies to landform function. And so that's why I wanted to show you some examples. Next slide. So this is an example of what flow channelization can do. This is a barrier beach. The ocean is on the right, and the bay side is on the left. And there's 4 flow channels here that cause damage to homes. And I'm going to show you some zoomed-in pictures of what those 4 channels did to those homes. But the water flowed from right to left there. So in the case of flow channel A, that house was washed completely off its foundation and back into the bay. For flow channels B and C on either side of this house, those undermined the foundation and caused it to collapse. And then if we go to the next slide, that's what caused flow channel D, caused one side of that house to collapse. So we had a lot of damage to houses that were on the landward part of the barrier beach as a result of some of the flow channelization on the front side. So these are some of the flow channelization is a significant challenge, but we need to try to look at what causes that and what we can do to avoid that.
The other thing is, just one quick thing, is there's lines in there, electricity, there's gas. Andrew was talking to Eric and I recently about that, and this is what you're not seeing when these things go down. It's more than just a house getting crushed.
Oh, yeah. Yep, so next slide. So some of the types of things that adversely affect the functions of flood control functions in coastal dunes are solid foundations, retaining and landscape walls, Some types of fencing, and I'm going to show you an example of what's called sturdy drift fencing, that has a significant impact. Any decks where the lowest horizontal structural member is not at least 2 feet above grade, that's going to interfere with the way the dune can function. Stairs with risers, and this is something that FEMA or the ASCE is now including in the international codes, is the risers are having a significant effect on blocking the flow of water and sand. And that new or enlarged solid concrete slabs, paves, or pavement can also have, because the water speeds up across those surfaces. Next slide.
Quick question on the stairs.
Yes.
It might be for the building commissioner. Do the building codes allow open risers now?
So the building, the newest international codes are specifically calling for not having those risers in the flood zones. So that's something that they are in the process of updating. Yep. So pavement or slabs, as I've mentioned, generally cause the water to increase in speed across it rather than slowing it down, and that can mean greater damage further inland. Pavers are considered pervious for stormwater purposes and rain infiltration, but they can become projectiles in storms, and they can get easily moved by that kind of flowing water that you saw. That's not going to be, even though it's pervious, it's still not coastal friendly in terms of putting in dunes and in dealing with overwash. So instead of those, we often recommend pea stone, gravel, shell. If people are trying to have some kind of an accessible access way to go from the driveway to the house, having a pile supported ramp is much more appropriate than a paved or a paver walkway.
I got a question for you. In the Bay Ave scenario that you showed there, a lot of the older houses are concrete all the way around a fixed foundation. But as they replace the houses, we're putting them up on, if you will, stilts, and we're putting maybe gravel underneath. And some of those have a paved area or a cement area between the front of the house and the seawall. And what comes over the seawall and the overwash, you don't want to be there, as you well know, because I've been up there 3 or 4 feet worth of water coming over the seawall.
Yep.
And what can we do to mitigate that rush when it comes up over and it hits that slab that's there, and then it washes out everything underneath, and then it eventually goes backwards and starts to wash out that little foundation and the seawall?
Yeah, so there's a couple different things. It's similar to Crescent Street or Crescent Beach in Hull in that there's no one answer. Getting the houses up on piling so that the water isn't being channelized around it is a start. Trying to make sure as many of those surfaces as possible are converted to the pervious, erodible surfaces so that they're not speeding up across there is one of the steps. And then the other is to think about trying to slow down some of the overtopping. And that goes to the nourishment proposal that the town's working on there, that would help slow down that, increase the energy dissipation before it gets to the wall and slow down the overtopping.
Is there anything that we could do in that area of the house and that wall? Because there isn't a whole lot that's up there right now, and what's happening is it's coming up, and you can see it washing out everything underneath that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, that's the situation that they were experiencing in Crescent Beach as well, is that having that same problem and having, in that situation, they did some education for the whole area, for the homeowners to explain, what everybody's dealing with. And everybody was observing the erosion that they had around their homes, the damage to the road, and there was, an educational effort to say, look, these are the things that need to change in order to reduce this for everybody, and for the town in terms of the storm damage to the road. And the town provided assistance in applying for elevation grants to help get those houses elevated, remove some of the concrete, the pavement, and they have made huge progress. It's not something that one project is going to fix, but as each one comes through, you want to be looking at making sure there's no adverse impact to that dune. Can you, reduce the pavement, the concrete, having those solid concrete things right behind the wall is very problematic. Having decks that connect to the wall is problematic as well, from both the structural standpoint as well as the impact. And the other point about those, that's a challenging situation with the houses in close proximity to the wall. One of FEMA's findings was that they're seeing a lot more damage with houses within 30 feet of seawalls. You observe it all the time here, I know.
We've made some strides. I mean, it's hard to get the homeowner to understand they can't have that nice patio out there. They could put some pavers, but then those become projectiles.
Exactly.
And as we've replaced the seawall, in the areas that we've replaced the seawall, we've made it so that people can't
Yep.
Hook up and
Yep.
cement right out to the
Yep.
seawall itself.
Yeah.
Because you can't tell when it's getting eroded, and the beach nourishment, that's why it's so important.
It is.
To get the sand out in front of the seawall.
Yeah, in the Crescent Beach situation in Hull, it wasn't a good situation for nourishment, so they had some other options they had to implement. Each one is very site-specific, and that's why CZM had a grant to help you look at where that would be appropriate for Marshfield. Where would it be cost-effective and appropriate to slow down that overwash? So there's a lot of different things that you can look at. Nourishment in that case would be appropriate for Bay Ave. And then as each one of them comes in, you can either let it happen as people renovate, or you can try to do some proactive outreach, with a workshop that targets, the residents in that area and talk about the storm damages, look at the damages that the town's dealing with and what's that's costing taxpayer-wise, and try to proactively encourage more of that and let them know that, that the town has applied for those elevation grants in the past. If the town's, in a position to do that again, then that helps encourage them to do that.
Yeah, the Bay area, they've been very good. We've been out there, our town planner's here, Greg Guimont, tonight, and we went out, one of our selectmen and myself, and we went door to door. We were very fortunate in the Bay area, we had a person that's sort of designated the local mayor.
Good.
And he sort of primed the pumps for us to get there on a beautiful Saturday to get people to sign the easements, because the only way you can do the beach nourishment if you get the signed easements. And we're going to be looking to do that in other areas.
We need one.
Rebecca, this is Jason.
So there's
One sec, Jason, one sec.
One person, I won't mention the person's name on TV, but we have one holdout
Yeah.
on Bay Avenue,
We
so
need everybody.
we need everybody, it has to be
To
100%.
100%.
Material coming out from Green Harbor this upcoming year, and we have material coming out of the South and North Rivers this year that we could use if we get those easements in place.
I would be surprised if you didn't get him, because for all of my life, he's been fighting no access for anything. Because we've even tried to encourage him,
Yeah.
but we should all continue.
Yes.
Jason, you had a comment?
Yes, I did. I was just going to mention that the role that vegetation can play in this as well, as far as binding sediments for coastal dunes and beaches, and that a lot of times that the turf grass that homeowners will put down does not do a particularly good job at stabilizing these mobile sediments. So CZM has a coastal landscaping guide that discusses this and provides some recommendations on various plantings. And I would direct folks to that as a resource as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you, Jason, because the plantings can make a big difference. Lawn grass has roots of 1 inch to 1.5 inches. It doesn't stand up to waves. And I know it looks nice, but if they're trying to help hold the sediments and slow down the water, a lot of the erosion control vegetation has roots that are 10, 20 feet deep. And we do have Storm Smart Properties fact sheets on vegetation that have some examples of what to use on banks, dunes, different areas, as well as the landscaping website. So-
I'd add that grass, your average grass looks so nice and green. It's not salt tolerant, so
No.
it gets, has a rough life out there, and you need to then spend an extraordinary amount of money keeping it going
Yeah.
some way, shape, or form or another. And the roots are really critical for these erodible soils. It's really important to think about that. So hybrids
Exactly.
and bringing in soft solutions is a good play when you can.
Excuse me, this is Bill Finn. I'm wondering if Jason could give a more formal title to that landscaping guide? Is that the title of it, CZM Landscaping Guide?
So it's on the Coastal Zone Management website. If you go to mass.gov/CZM, and you search for coastal landscaping, that should come up. You can also search for Storm Smart Properties, and we have some Storm Smart Properties fact sheets, one of which is on vegetation.
Bill,
And
you-
that also refers you straight to the landscaping website.
Thank you.
Bill, when you're down by conservation, we got printouts for you, and we can also send you a PDF if you need it as well.
So short of a very successful nourishment program, you're gonna continue to have this erosion in these areas. And you're gonna have to put this material back.
Yeah, if you have a tremendous amount of overtopping, there is going to be scour erosion. The energy has to get dissipated somehow.
Right, so has there been a case where they do this with a neighborhood approach that, you can't do this by one individual small lot?
Right,
It needs to be addressed.
it does.
Everything has to be done in a similar manner.
Right, and
Correct.
the nourishment needs to be done on a,
Well, the nourishment, but shorter than nourishment,
Right.
every time you have these events and you get all this erosion, it needs to be put back. If one person has one kind of pavers and somebody else has another kind of pavers and everything else,
Right.
I mean, wouldn't it be better to have a standard material so it could just all get put back? And
well, I think, what you're looking at is as projects come through, those are the ones that you get to look at in terms of what the requirements should be for the sites. The other option is to be proactive and do some education and some outreach to those homeowners and explain some of the issues with the storm damage, why they're seeing those patterns, the damage to the roads that's causing the town taxpayer money to be spent on addressing that, and what they can do, what the options are, what would make it better. People are very receptive when they understand more of what's going on. They just, often when you see a storm, you have perceptions of what you think might be going on. And, I've heard homeowners say, well, because they put their house up on pilings, all of a sudden I'm getting more water. They don't understand that now there's not channelization of flow, it's actually flowing over a broader area, and that's a good thing. And trying to understand those patterns is part of the process, and doing some proactive education can be very helpful.
But I think to go back to Joe's question about trying to find something to dissipate the energy.
Yeah.
You talk about pavers could be projectiles,
Yes.
but cobbles actually can dissipate the energy, right? When you look at some of the areas of natural dunes where they have cobble areas, don't they say that they stand up better because
Well, it does take more to move gravel and cobble than it does sand. It takes more energy. So, since your dunes are a mix of sand, gravel, and cobble, putting in some cobble would be compatible. You just don't want to go with riprap. You want to make sure it is compatible with the system.
So to Bert's point, I think he's targeting on a site, and then on a beach, Bert, you got a wider fan of these cobbles, and they move like the water, and they just fan together. So they undulate really nicely, and they dissipate that energy. But
they
in a,
undulate right into the road? I'm thinking of Hummerock,
Right.
I mean, it's,
I'm thinking
Well-
of just the sites where we have the impervious table and the cross-section, and we require, clear and convincing information that you have pervious, particular areas, a reduction of the impervious, or you have pervious under the cross-section, that is. How do you tie that in? And Joe and I looked at this one particular site. It's got a square underneath the house, got pilings, beautiful. sediment's rolling out. So how do you protect that? Came up with a solution, and we shall see, if they go that route or not. So how do the individual sites get protected? That's a tough one.
Yeah, and you want to think about trying to dissipate the energy more than how you stop the water. And that's really what you want to think about is what's the best way to dissipate the energy. And the more you dissipate the energy, the less erosion you get.
Right. It's the force that has to stop. I love the force on some sides, but others I don't.
All right, so if we go to the next slide. So this is an example of sturdy drift fence. And this is something that both CZM and DEP consider to have significant adverse impacts because of the size of the posts. Those are 6 to 8 inch larger posts, and some of them are as big as 10. Very large components, and there's a lot more scour around those. Fences are supposed to be to trap sand and help build dunes. This is acting like a wave break, and it ends up causing a lot more adverse impacts. Next slide. So the larger posts have the increased scour around them. The fence interferes with the sediment flow along the shoreline, causes a wind tunnel effect, and marine debris can be, the metal marine debris, when this is damaged, is very significant. So what we recommend is the more traditional sand fencing if you're trying to trap sand. The sturdy drift fencing would also interfere with the ability of the gravel and the cobble to shift, particularly in some areas. So you want to try to avoid that because it does cause adverse impacts. Next. So solid fences, obviously those are interfering with the ability of the dune to function. In this case, they were trying to keep the dune out of a parking area, and that's understandable, but the dune could be vegetated to stabilize it rather than putting in a fence. And so there usually are options, and if you're trying to create some kind of a visual barrier, you could use vegetation instead. If you go to the next slide. Using, whether it's, whatever vegetation you use. You could use evergreens or something like this. Using salt-tolerant plants is obviously appropriate in a coastal area. Next slide. So we've talked about the power of storms. This is a road in Westport. When Irene came through, it was pretty much a non-event for most of Massachusetts in terms of coastal damage. But Westport got a little bit of the wave energy, and it ripped up 1,000 feet of road. The power of the waves is pretty significant. And just because something's paved doesn't mean it's not going to try to function in a storm and try to dissipate energy. They actually were able to shift this road landward because trying to reestablish it where it wasn't going to be realistic or sustainable. Next slide. This is another situation where this is a barrier beach. It is a coastal dune, but there's a lot of altered resource area here. There's actually a paved road on the right, and that's a grassed parking area. But this is after a storm where you can see a lot of overwash has occurred. It still can provide the storm damage prevention and flood control. It's not providing sediment to the beach any longer. But it is important that the water can still flow over that entire area to dissipate the energy. So retaining walls can clearly divert energy just like a solid foundation could. And so when you put this retaining wall around it was intended to block the water from getting to that house, that is redirecting it around to both the adjacent neighbors. And so it's important to think about, when people want to have the water go somewhere else, you really need it to go over as broad of an area as possible rather than trying to redirect it. So other efforts and these are all dunes on barrier beaches, solid walls, terraces, decks that aren't 2 feet above the dune, or even this house on the lower right here. This is a breakaway wall, so it's constructed to FEMA standards, but it doesn't allow the water to flow under the entire house. And so for landform function purposes, having those solid walls below the flood elevation is problematic from a resource protection standpoint. So even though that might have been okay under building code, from a Wetlands Act standpoint, they should have had open pilings there. And so it's just thinking about the fact that that breakaway wall isn't supposed to give until a certain point in a storm, and in the smaller storms, it's still going to redirect the flow around it.
Rebecca, I have a quick question about that, if I may.
Yes.
So with the velocity zones, and you're allowed to have the breakaway walls under the pilings, but I always seriously discourage people from doing that for that exact reason, where those things end up becoming projectiles if they function correctly. If the guys don't, if they build it correctly, which
Right.
is definitely hard to do. So I think we're trying to discourage people from doing it.
Yeah, I agree with you, and, there are some places where the building code is interpreted that it's okay, and it's just something that I want to make clear is there is a difference between building code and Wetlands Act, because you're looking at two different things, and they don't always have to be the same requirements, because you're governing landform function and they're looking at building code, so they have to meet both. Okay. So we've talked about the damage adjacent to seawalls, and, it is better if the decks are elevated, so that they're not getting that damage. So it is tricky when you have such tight space in between seawalls and houses. But the elevated decks, there are going to be specific requirements that the building inspector is looking at as to how those are attached to the house or whether they're independent. But in terms of letting the water flow over the seawall and, hopefully getting those houses elevated, having it flow over as broad of an area as possible, not having all the solid concrete there is going to make a big difference. So it's making those changes. Some of it is a question of whether the town wants to just see it project by project coming in, have a policy, and when you have storm damage, you're going to have a lot more of those things in place that you want to see improvements in, because when you get storms, there's going to be a lot of damage. So making sure that you're clear about what they can run right out and repair, what needs to be improved is important, and doing some education.
I just want to add something real quick to that too, again, Rebecca. I think in the past we haven't really had the greatest kind of documentation of substantial damage in town, and that's one of the things I'm trying to work on, so that when the next storm does happen, we can capture a lot of the substantial damage before they start applying for permits to rebuild, and kind of, identify which projects are going to need to be elevated in the future, so that we don't have people kind of trying to skirt the issue on the substantial improvement or substantial damage requirement, and that they're getting the houses elevated properly, and then we're not ended up with a lot of these homes where people are, I think Joe was talking about it with a new home put on pilings with cobble underneath, but the two houses on either side have concrete all the way up to the house, and this way we can kind of, and when we have that big event, we can kind of say, all right, well, all three of you guys are substantial damage or substantial improvement and have to elevate on open pilings. And I think that'll help us in the future if we have a better kind of system for handling that.
Well, one of the things that you can think about is asking the state for technical assistance in doing some of those evaluations. The state inspectors often reach out to communities to offer assistance because, as a building official, you're one person and there's a limit as to how much you can cover. So there are resources available to help with that. Okay, next slide. So some general review guidelines is, keep in mind that performance standards for dunes and for primary dunes and all dunes on barrier beaches is that no adverse impact standard. There need to be making improvements, improving that, not looking at, okay, well, maybe this is, maybe pavers would be okay here. Pavers are going to have an adverse impact. Pavement is going to have an adverse impact. You need to look at those really carefully because they do make a big difference in storms. So virtually all coastal dunes and floodplains provide storm damage prevention and flood control. When we were working on developing the guidance for the manual, we were trying to think about where could we think of a dune that wouldn't provide storm damage prevention and flood control. And we were hard pressed. I think that we finally came up with the middle of the Hull Peninsula when you're 6 rows in, maybe. So it's, you know, there's always that function there that you need to be considering. So even though you're having applicants come in saying, well, look at how altered this is, it's all paved, it's all concrete, there's still function. So all projects should be reviewed relative to their exposure based on the flood zones that are the FEMA maps, even though they have their imperfections, you know, that's what we have. We use the information we have about storm damage in terms of documentation, of pictures, photographs, and you look at the site relative to what function it would provide. Where is it in that process of, you think about the water coming from, you know, seaward to landward, where is it in that continuum? How much water is there? What's the momentum? What's the wave energy? And each site is going to be a little bit different. So we try to provide some guidance, and then we also provide technical assistance, not for every single project, but on those tricky projects where you're trying to figure it out and need some assistance, we're available. Next slide. So the manual is online on both the CZM and DEP websites. And Andrew, Jason and I are available to try to answer questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, Rebecca, really
Excellent.
great.
That's outstanding.
Really great. Where do we take it from here, Chair Hannafin?
Do you have any more questions?
Does anyone open it up to questions from commissioners? Anyone on Zoom? Anyone here in the audience?
I had a question, maybe for Greg, is our floodplain software, is that the latest version that Rebecca was speaking about?
It doesn't have that layer of the
Okay.
M-I-W-A and M-O-W-A.
So-
Moa and Maiwa, right?
If you go to the Map Service Center, it's actually relatively user-friendly. It might take a little getting used to, but the Map Service Center, you put in an address and it brings up the map. So if you just do, it's msc.fema.gov, that's the address. And it's the FEMA Map Service Center. You literally put in a street address and it brings up the map. And it will have all the map changes that are current and effective there. It gives you an option of what's called the National Flood Hazard Layer Viewer. And that is more like a MassGIS or an Oliver viewer. It doesn't require a lot of GIS skills. Believe me, I'm not the most tech savvy person. It's relatively straightforward. You can turn on and off layers, and the limit of moderate wave action is one of those things you can turn on and off.
And, sorry, I'll just interject real quick, Bert, and anybody else, I use that map service center probably 3 or 4 at least times a day. So if anybody has any questions, wants a little demonstration how to use it, feel free anytime. I'll help you navigate that site because I use it every day.
Bert, we also have the paper copies, but something for the town to consider. Since we've done our big FEMA map changes, maybe it's time we just get rid of our map that we were using to help the residents understand what's going on. And just go directly to FEMA. Now, unfortunately, the FEMA ones are a little more harder to read because they have so many layers on them. Versus ours was fairly easy to read for elevation purposes, which was the main point of those.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Greg, I mean, you want to capture the 80-90% that are wanting the information, and the system that you've got in place on the town probably provides adequate information. You get more technical. Andrew's going to be an expert on that. I struggle sometimes with those FEMA maps themselves, but they are useful if you're willing to study for them. And Concom also has some separate websites that come from DEP from USDA, NRCS, et cetera. And we would love to combine them into our floodplain map to a usable basis so that the other departments, the public, everybody can benefit. It's not terribly difficult. So,
Well, it's-
with effort and time and,
Yeah, that,
you know,
that viewer's not,
dedication.
not that hard to use. When, we can suggest as a topic, Andrew, for your, Conservation Commission network, to possibly do a demo for them on how to use that viewer with how to turn the layers on and off so that everybody has a handle on that and get you a little bit of training. Once you've done it a couple times, it's pretty straightforward. And I'm literally not the most tech savvy person, so if I can handle it, you can handle it, Bill.
I'm like you, and I
You
figured
can-
it out, yeah.
You can handle this.
Yeah.
Usually it just takes a little bit of instruction. You know, that helps me when I'm looking at some of these newer resources, is
Yeah.
just give me some information to start with and get me pointed in the right direction.
Right.
So we can do that as a demo for that network. That would help.
Yeah, we can do that.
Thank you, Andrew. I know you've been really helpful to us. Eric and I have reached you. You've given courses to this to other departments and so on. So I appreciate you being a resource to the other departments here that may reach you, be it Andrew, Stewart, the building commissioner, or the town planner, Greg Guillemot, or the Board of Health Director, Gary Russell, or town administrator commissioners. They may come to you now because, you've been quiet, but you're a powerful source of information, and we're grateful for that, along with you, Jason.
We're here to help.
So the part of the reason for suggesting the map service center specifically for the commission is, if you're trying to just look at what the flood zones might be, and not get an exact answer, that's one thing. But if you need a specific parcel, you want to double check what's the most up-to-date information. So being able to check that, is really important for permit processing. And we do have guidance, in the manual on how to delineate the floodplain, how to interpret those flood maps, which is an art in itself. And we've put together guidance on that because we weren't necessarily happy with FEMA guidance. We wanted to make it a little clearer, so.
Rebecca, with FEMA, they define the V zone and the limit of moderate wave action as the landward extent of a coastal dune. So is that not the same interpretation then? So that's going to be, that's kind of more of a guide then? And then what we got to do is get more into the site-specific, like soil evaluations to determine whether it's a coastal dune, especially the stuff behind, like Brant Rock, behind the seawall.
So what FEMA delineates on their maps is the primary frontal dune, not the coastal dune. And the primary frontal dune is just the first dune along the coast. And that has a very specific definition, and there's delineation methodology in the manual. But even that is done at a pretty broad brush level. And so if a Conservation Commission had a project that came before them, I would say, that there's a lot of, you wouldn't want to use that for site-specific figuring out where that primary frontal dune is either. I've seen what goes into that. Yeah. But anyway, that's, it's just the primary frontal dune. It's not the full coastal dune under the regulations. And so that you do need to talk to the Concom for, what their determination is on where the coastal dune is, and the applicant needs to work with them on providing that subsurface soil information so that they can make that determination.
Just to parlay on that, Andrew, point, the definition of barrier beach is, generally speaking, coastal dune and barrier coastal beach. So broad brush, when we get the layers that we look at, the assumption is automatically it's burden of proof on the applicant to show it's not coastal dune. And they could do that by doing these soil studies, and that's where the site-specific comes in.
Yeah.
So if we're down, I'm just going to say, I'm trying to remember, Roosevelt was a recent one. No, just to get an area of town, down close to Salt Marsh, in Barrier Beach, coastal dune. If they truly wanted to make sure that they were not in coastal dune, they should do one of the soil studies that we've talked about in order to withdraw from the coastal dune elements. Otherwise, we've got the assumption it's coastal dune.
Yeah, the
Is
FEMA
that-
maps are just giving you that primary frontal dune.
So I guess the only thing that I,
Sorry, I don't mean to be rude,
when
but
you're
it's,
talking about Roosevelt, calling that a coastal dune, like,
it's not gonna
you know,
work.
when Rebecca was talking about that, she was talking about like, you know, you had to have the sand over the top with the glacial fill, you know, like had to be more than 50%. I mean, I don't see any sand down on Roosevelt Road, you know, so like that's the kind of thing where I think we need to get a little bit better at defining exactly where the delineation is for coastal dune within the barrier beach system.
So
So I
you're,
was asking that to Andrew Poynt, because he's got the DEP, I'm sorry to
Oh,
get in,
okay.
yeah. So Andrew Poynt, going back to you again, so we got Barrier Beach coastal dune, the definition's met. The individual doesn't want to develop, let's say, by coastal dune criteria. Wouldn't it behoove them to do the site-specific study, show that they don't have coastal dune, which they may or may not be able to prove?
Yes, they would have to do on-site field work to determine that. But I agree with Rebecca on everything that she is saying. And you know, the same is the case for inland wetlands. We have maps that and GIS resources that allow us to have for planning purposes, we're able to have a better idea of what's out there. But with any wetland resource area, we need to do on the field surveying to confirm where the wetland resources are.
yeah, I'm not familiar with where Roosevelt is, so I'll stay out of that one. But you think of Bay Ave, and how developed that area is, you're not seeing a lot of sand on the surface. Unfortunately, because there's so much development, you can't just look at it and tell whether it's a dune. You do have to look at the subsurface sediments. And so there's guidance in the manual that talks about what kind of information the commission should ask for in terms of making that delineation, and it's looking at the subsurface soils.
So we've been basing it on definitions and then the burden of proof on the applicants. If that shifts, that means that they gotta do the drilling if we have standards like that, like every time. So that's something to think about.
Well, if the applicant comes in with a delineation and you look at it based on what you know and say you need more information, you need subsurface soils or whatever, that's reasonable for the commission to ask.
Right.
And if it is on a barrier beach, it's one of two resource areas. It is either coastal beach or coastal dune or wetland. There could be interdunal wetland sometimes, but it's one or the other. So no matter how altered it is, you still have coastal dune in barrier beaches.
Right. And if they do the soil studies and they show they're out, they're out. It's the end of that. Even if they're right in the middle of the other area, that's, and the neighboring site might be coastal dune. It's just what happens. You know, that'd be a unique situation, but the soil
Well, it
studies
seems
would.
to me over a period of time, it ought to be able to be mapped. I mean, you're gonna have every individual lot
What happens
be
is,
something different.
yeah, so what happens is like, a broader brush, the USDA, NRCS did, various soil studies around the country. We'll just use that. And those are generic because there might be a plot here and maybe a quarter of a mile away, the second plot. So that's why the site-specific becomes vital to final determination. But the general definition of coastal dune is, or barrier beach is coastal dune, coastal beach. So it's one or the other, and burden of proof on the applicant. They can use the soil studies to get that site taken out of being coastal dune through that mechanism.
Well, if it is barrier beach though,
Very little chance.
it's coastal dune. If it's part of the barrier beach, even with soil analysis, if you're part of the barrier beach and that's a whole system that's winter wave deposited to start with, then you could be looking at artificial fill, but
Yeah.
that's it.
So in that case, you can do it on a large.
If you know the whole area is barrier
Oh,
beach.
it's all barrier beach.
So you have a
Don't have to
coastal
worry
dune
about
out
doing
there
a
in the
study.
bank,
Yeah.
I believe.
Just going back
This is
to
Jason. Just real quickly, just for
Rebecca's information, Roosevelt Road is back behind Ocean Street, between Grant Rock and Fieldston, and it's right in the middle of a barrier beach polygon as identified on MassGIS.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, so we don't want to get too far in the weeds on site-specific stuff. We're trying to give you some general guidance, which is if you are on a mapped barrier beach, you know, unless the town, you know, has information that comes forward and we say, you know, we don't think this is a barrier beach, we want to get this de-designated, you know, that's possible. You could consider it, but in most cases, if you're on a barrier beach, you know, for example, Hummerock Beach, you've got Situate and Marshfield both in Hummerock, those are barrier beaches. The whole thing is coastal dune. There's no glacial in there, other than third cliff, fourth cliff.
So Rebecca, question, for practical purposes, thinking of the homeowner in his or her wallet. They're coming in and they're looking at putting up, let's call it a new house. Somebody magically put a piece of property there, and they wanted to argue that it was not a barrier beach. They would have to go out and do the soil samples. But at some point, doesn't it just make sense to, the only thing that really is going to bother them is putting in the posts rather than anything else. And at some point, it's just less hassle to put in the posts, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
well
it's
put.
better
That's-
for them,
that's a-
public safety wise, and,
Yeah.
you know, in terms of their insurance rates are better if they're on open pilings, in a dune.
Yeah, so they're just better off all the way around. Even if somebody made a mistake and it's not barrier beach, but they're in the general area, they're better off.
They are.
Thank you.
Good point. I think my long-winded version is,
Sometimes they're, because the houses around them still have concrete foundations, that's sort of, well, they have it, and so what's the
Yeah,
difference?
that's the hard part.
That's the hard part, but if we can, that channelization argument you had, and show that to people and educate them, that they will be better off, perhaps that would work. But
Well, it's
that's-
also, you know, for you, it's the bottom line is the performance standards. And so a solid foundation may have been what was put in a long time ago, but in order to meet the standards now, and the standard isn't just for, you know, protecting a few blades of grass. You know, this isn't about bunny huggers. This is about resource protection, storm damage prevention, and flood control. And it is important to understand some of that background, and that's why I wanted to show you those pictures of, you know, the storm damage and the reports from FEMA, and that they're finding that scour, even around pilings, there's still scour. And it's minimizing that scour so that you reduce the storm damage and reduce the threat to the building. They had, in the MAT report, there were a couple examples of two houses side by side. They actually looked kind of identical, but they must have been installed differently. They both looked like they had pilings. One's leaning and the other's standing straight. So in one case, the pilings went deep enough, in the other case, they didn't. It's all about what happens in the really big storms and making sure that we're prepared for that. Because it can be, when you look at, you know, what happens in these massive storms, it's catastrophic for the folks that aren't built to that standard.
Rebecca, I did want to mention something that's very interesting that you touched upon, and Andrew, our building commissioner. We have a parcel in town which was really, it's one of the last houses that was destroyed as you enter Brant Rock. They're putting the piles in now, and Andrew discovered that there was a real serious issue with those pilings, that they're not down far enough, it's too much sway, they're supposed to like 4, and these are like 7 and 8. And you know, Andrew's been having a tough time trying to convince the owner and the developer that those piles just aren't right. You know, they're gonna, you know, they keep bringing in engineers. If the engineer doesn't agree, the homeowner gets another engineer. And
Yeah,
you know, I
it's-
think to
Yeah.
Joe's point and stuff about, I think there's a stigma. You know, people still, it's, you know, it's funny. People that have been rooted on the coast and in town want to keep things the way they are,
Yeah.
even though they see the damage happening right around them. And as the property gets sold, soon as someone new comes in there, bang, you know, they're raising the house, they're putting in, and you can see even the quality, like the poles, you know, that they put in. Some of them are really huge, you know, bigger than like a telephone pole going in to support the structure.
Yeah, it makes a big difference how it's built. It can be challenging, or a little more challenging in areas with the cobble and the gravel, trying to get those piles in correctly. So sometimes they have to do helical piles rather than the driven piles, because the cobble does make it a little more challenging to get in structurally.
So the helical
That parcel Michael was talking about was the opening page of your presentation tonight.
Yeah, it's
That
the one
was-
that got condemned, Rebecca, you know.
That was just the easy one to pick, the easy one to pick from Wicked Local of
No, we're not supposed to do this. We just happen to.
yeah, I just, want to show an example, but not put anybody in the spotlight necessarily.
Well, they'll
So
get it
I
done.
hope at least all of you can understand why I want to make sure that those piles go in correctly.
Yeah, well, that's the thing is and when you look at these, if you spend some time with these mitigation assessment team reports and see, all the things that they look at and why these houses fail, the details matter. And it's, it's kind of scary sometimes when you think about some of the details that you want to make sure are not overlooked. And so, that's why I want to give you enough information, but hopefully not overwhelm you.
I think one last.
Rebecca, just real quick clarification on like building code stuff. So when we talk about open pile foundation, right, we have several types of piles. They don't just have to be timber piles. You mentioned helical piles, but you can also have like caissons and concrete piles, right? Is that also acceptable as long as it doesn't have a footing?
As long as it doesn't have a footing or a grade beam, and they say
Yep.
it's structurally sound, if they can certify that it's going deep enough, and that's what you're looking at is, whether they meet those
Yeah.
criteria. You want to have you just want to have as the diameter and just not going down to a grade beam or footing.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
I just want to know what options we have for people.
Absolutely.
That was the question I was going to ask, but I have one last one now.
Okay.
Do we have an option of getting copies of or PDF of your presentation?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Can we post that on our website? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Great, we'd love to do that, and we'd like to share it with our colleagues in case they wanted to, town as well, whatever wants it. I think it's a good lesson learned for everybody to go forward and, build right and everything. That's good. Yeah.
Great.
Are there any more questions? If not, I want to thank Rebecca and Andrew and Jason. That was hugely informative. Thank you very much. I want to thank Kyle over there for
Kyle.
giving up his evening for
Yes.
IT.
Thank you, Kyle.
And if there is no further comment or question, I move that we adjourn. We close the meeting. Second, I'm going to do a roll call. Commissioner Lagi?
Art, you're muted.
Thumbs up, Art.
We got to hear you.
Sorry about that, I'm up here in Maine and cloistered away, that's why the mask is here, sorry. But yes, I agree, we
Okay.
should close.
Thank you, Art.
Vice
A
Chair?
very, very, very good presentation. That was excellent.
Agreed.
Thank you, Art.
Yes.
Susan
Commissioner
Karen,
Karen?
yes.
Commissioner Ring?
Joe Ring, yes.
Commissioner Hannafin? Yes.
It's
are
a
adjourned.
5:00. We are adjourned. Very good. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you
All right.
very much.
Rebecca, nice job. Thank you.